Yeah, I'm Sebastian, and I'm going to talk in the next 15 minutes a bit about our development journey on Vega. So, yeah, we are JOYN, we are a German streaming application. I have a screenshot later on, but as this is officially a dev meetup, I also brought a bit like our technical lessons that we made along the way, and I'm going to talk about basically our biggest lesson that we did, that sometimes to build a real performant React Native application, it means to just leave React Native at all. So, who I am? I'm Sebastian. I'm building smart TV applications for ProSieben for more than 5 years now, and I did, together with my team, were mainly doing pure TypeScript and React.js applications, so our background is not Android, it's not native, it's really just like web-based smart TV development, and we build applications for the usual suspects. We had a Samsung application, a Chile application, a Panasonic application. We dabbled a bit with the skyboxes that some of you might have under their TVs. We worked, and we're currently again working with HBB TV. And yeah, and that's our application. To no surprise, it looks like nearly any other streaming application under the sun. We have a few lanes, we have a side navigation, we have a top navigation, and that's it. I assume that most of you built or planning to build something that will look very, very similar to that. We are a German streaming application. Our business model is AVOD, so everything that we're doing is free for the user. The only thing that we need is a registration, so that we're getting a bit of data, and that's basically it. Yeah, now I want to get a bit in our story, because our story actually begins with a project cancellation. So basically there was March 2023, and yeah, we were doing a restructuring. The team's previous project was cancelled, and there was actually no other project in sight. So I think we all know what this usually would have meant, that if not by surprise, some other project would have landed. Yeah. But then, very early in March and April, that we got some rumors about Amazon doing something with Kepler, Fire TV, whatnot. Obviously, Google yielded absolutely no results on that. But in April 2023, we just got these suspicious sticks, which looked like Fire TV sticks, but behaved absolutely not like Fire TV sticks, with this weird card next to it. And yeah, and then we're actually, because we had this fully staffed engineering team, we had something to work on, so we kicked off development in June 2023 already with SDK version 0.4. And yeah, at 0.4, things were bad. I kind of regret that I not did any screenshot or any videos along the way, because that would make for a really fun presentation, I would say. But unfortunately, yeah, this slide is just a slide with text. But the SDK was in alpha, and all the primitives were in alpha state. So it was not really possible to build a working application with what was built into the SDK at this point. But we needed to show something. We were a team without a project, and we needed to prove that we can build right now something with the Vega SDK. So the first thing that we did, we started from the very beginning with a simple view element and built everything from ground up. So we're running our own custom focus element, we built our own scrolling, we built our own lanes, and all these things basically enabled us that we used around 9 months, and then we had the fully working JOYN application done. Without playback, but playback is a complete different story which could cover a whole other talk, so I won't talk about playback in this talk at all. And yeah, we had a very similar lesson that because we are a React.js team, we are accustomed to web-based development, and at the beginning, we just approached this React Native application like we would approach any other web application. But what we very, very soon learned is that React Native and React.js are two different beasts, even so we heard in the workshop this morning that write once, run everywhere. From our perspective, this not necessarily holds true. And two of the really critical lessons that we had is that reducing re-renders, or the re-renders are extremely expensive on Vega. So it's even more critical to think about ways to minimize the number of re-renders in React Native than it is in React.js. We have our ideas why this is that way, but I think those would be too much for this presentation. And then also the other one is that as a React.js developer, you're accustomed to do everything in React.js. You write your nice custom hooks, reusable logic, you share them across components, and you never basically leave React.js world. But for React Native, or at least the Vega branch of React Native, we learned that sometimes if you want to go really, really fast, you need to just go into pure TypeScript instead of trying to do everything in React Native. Yeah, and as promised, I want to show you a small example of what we did. So I'm now talking about the usual player page, which hopefully all of us have or will have in some capacity in their application. As I mentioned, the team has a kind of a troubled history, so we built quite a few player pages in our history. And the player page was, from my experience, always the page which degrades the fastest. Because it's this page, nice, very nice, perfectly built, you turn around for 30 seconds, 3 product requirements land, and it's 300 lines of code have been added to this page. And and in the end of our journey with React.js, we basically ended up with a very, very strict separation of concerns. So at the very top, we're having our player component, which encapsulates the whole business logic. So it takes care about loading the sources, instantiating the player, and also attaching the listeners. And below that, we're having a presentation-only component, which obviously consists of multiple subcomponents, which renders the player UI. There are the buttons for controlling the trick play, there's the video information, there's the slider, which shows the duration and the progress. And the only thing that this component needs to do, it needs to show whatever the player component feeds it. This worked extremely well for us in React.js, because in the end, the player does an update. Let's say the player updated the progress, it bubbles nicely through, and only the progress bar is re-rendering. However, in the React Native branch of Vega, this didn't hold true from our experience. So this pattern led to a very, very sluggish UI experience, and also around 5 seconds before we actually could start playback. And these were two things that we didn't really want to have for our customers. So we thought about ways to make this nicer. And now comes the part where we're pulling out things outside of React Native. And in this case, we're pulling out the player component into a pure JavaScript class. So we're now having a pure JavaScript class, which takes care about the same things that the player component did previously. It instantiates the player, loads the sources, attaches the listeners. And then, for the update cycle, we wanted to get the updates to exactly the places where they count. So we didn't want to basically traverse the whole tree to the various parts. Instead of, if we're updating the duration, we only want the progress bar to know. If we're updating the video information, we only want the video information section to know. So what we're basically doing is that the Play UI is now only responsible for collecting all the references to the component it's composed of, and it hands it over to the controller. And after that, the Play UI is done with its job, because then only the controller basically takes care about placing the updates directly with the different components. And in the end, this basically cut our startup by 50%. So we have basically 2.5 seconds startup at this point. The UI, I would say, not way faster, or definitely way faster. I would even say blazingly fast, but I'm also kind of biased. And we also ended up with a way better maintainability, because now everything that's going on in the player is contained in one single controller. So it's not like, hey, I have the 17 hooks which compose my Play UI, and everybody plays a bit into the final state of the UI. It's basically, if you want to know what's going up, when the duration changes, there's exactly one place to look. And this, yeah, made it very nice for us. One thing I need to add before I close is that obviously, because the team was kind of mad that I didn't include the view model because the controller is not allowed to directly talk to the player UI because it would be bad software engineering, blah, blah. So obviously, this whole thing is abstracted away with a view model in between. So the controller and the player UI don't know anything from each other. They basically just connected via the view model, which defines some interface for the controller to understand and knows how to place the updates that the controller does. So yeah, it's basically something like view model controller because we don't have a separate model class. Yeah, and then looping back, it's this skipping the tree is something that we're not only applying for the player UI, but basically in all places where performance matters. And I think also something that all of the streaming applications have is some kind of component which renders our stack of lanes. For us, we call it very easy the lane stack, which is basically the main component of most of the streaming applications. And here basically in a different way, the lanes itself are asking all the time, hey, is data for me there? Is new data for me there? And then they only re-render at the lowest possible level instead of traversing the whole stack from the bottom, which also makes it a very, very performant component. Then the other thing is leaving React. We saw for one the controller, but also there are quite a few things that are going on that are not dependent in any way for the React lifecycle. For example, one thing for us is login with Amazon. Login with Amazon for us is a three-way process, talking to Amazon, talking to our backend, and refreshing the user state in the end. And this is something that turned out to be extremely unperformant if you put it in a nice hook, but gets way, way more performant if you just create a service that you call and basically leave the React world for this. And then basically closing words. Yeah, it was, I would say, actually a quite frustrating journey because I think it took around 6 to 8 SDK updates before our app was dead, every SDK update. But in the end, it was, I think, incredibly educational for the whole team because it's not every day that you really get to build something from the ground up while it's developed at the same time, because it really requires you to look deeply in what's going on and learning things that you usually would not learn, because React.js is basically done. There's not much learning to be done because you can find every answer just freely written on the internet. But when you don't really know what's going on, you tend to look deeper, and that's basically where most learning came from. Good. Thank you.